In this lesson, we'll take a look at using the pose tools to add a little bit more of a natural pose to our character. So right now our little guy is built in kind of what's called a T-pose, and that's basically the arms straight out and these pieces straight out, and that just aids in rigging, adding bones to a character. If you're going to be, moving it along through production, makes things a little bit easier. You might also see them in more of an M pose with the arms down a little bit. That's also common as well. For our case, though, we want to actually put this guy into a little bit more of a natural pose, and we can do that here in Mudbox using the pose tools. So it's going to be this tab next to the sculpt tools, paint tools, and curve tools right over here, and there's only 4 of those to use. Let's go ahead and dial down our geometry to maybe down a couple of levels. So let's go down to level 6, maybe down to level 4. And then let's go to create joint. And we've got this one joint at a time checked. You can actually create more complex skeletons, but for our purposes, we just want to kind of create a joint and pose it, create a joint and pose it. So to do that, we're going to choose one joint at a time. Everything else will leave the same. So with this create joint tool selected, we'll click where we want the joint and then drag out to the end of the arm. And the length of this green arrow here is going to kind of tell us how the weighting is going to fall off. And then the ring kind of indicates where that weighting is going to occur. So we want it just around the arm, so we'll rotate it until it's just going around the shoulder there. So the green areas are what's going to move, and anything that's not green is not. So that's your weighting there. If you want to change the weighting, you can choose weights, and you can paint in weights. But for us, we're just going to go ahead and click now pose. And so what we can do is now rotate by clicking and dragging left mouse. If we middle mouse, we can move this. So we might want to move it down a little bit. We can also change the axis by clicking and dragging on the actual joint. So I can kind of pull this back. I can kind of pull it down like that. Okay, so something like that. Now let's go ahead and we can commit that pose by clicking on the create joint button again. And that commits that pose down. You could also, if you wanted to add these poses on a sculpt layer, you could do that too. So we'll go ahead and let that pose commit, and then we'll move down to the elbow and do the same thing until we get the arm posed up like we want it to. Okay, so back to create joint, come down to the elbow. Don't want to drag it down too far because we don't want that weighting to be too soft. And then come in here to pose, and we can move this elbow up a little bit. Okay, back to create joint. It's going to commit that pose of the elbow. And then we'll be able to move down to each successive joint. So down to the wrist and finally down to the fingers. So now coming down to the wrist, do the same thing here. And then we'll kind of pose this up. So let me kind of move this down a little bit. Sort of rotate it around. And then I always like to come in and just bend the fingers a little bit, just to put him in a little bit more of a natural pose. Having the fingers straight out is very rarely a natural look. So having the fingers and the thumb bent slightly will make it look a little bit more natural. So let's come to the first finger here, right at this joint, making sure we don't have that line cross across to any of the other fingers. We'll go down and we'll bend that. And then there's one more joint down here at the end. So we'll go create joint. And then kind of right in here is where we'll create that last joint on this finger. And then we can repeat that on this finger and on the thumb as well to create a little bit more of a natural look for the hand. Okay, so one more kind of right down there. Come into pose. And you can sort of pose that up. You can see because our weighting is a little bit soft that we're not getting that sharp line there. So that's just something to be aware of. We'll go ahead and commit that. The softer transition that you have, you're not going to have that nice wrinkle or crease there. But you can always go back in and do sculpting on this after you pose it. That's not a problem. So we'll go ahead and let that commit, and then let's do our other fingers. So now this one we want to bend just a little bit. So we'll go ahead and create our joint, bend that a little, commit that, and then all we have left to do is this joint here and then this one. Then we'll move up to the head, and those little bits on the head. So right down here, last little bit, I'm going to rotate this a bit. And then we'll do the thumb, and then we'll move up to that piece on top. And we'll do the one arm over here, and then you can do something kind of asymmetrical on the other side if you want to do something fun or interesting. Or if you want to make it the same, you can do that too. Make it similar. Try to avoid complete symmetry. Okay, so come in here, and again, you want to make sure that that line, sometimes you're not going to be pointing straight down the joint, or your line will come across the fingers. And so here, it's okay if you kind of pull off to the side like that. That'll still work fine. And then we can come down here and maybe even move it a little bit. Maybe rotate it this way. So just makes it look a little bit more natural, okay? So go ahead and commit that, and then we can come up here and bend this guy down. So the little tube on his head, and kind of bend that over. So let's come up to the head, and we'll just add that in. Draw it out towards the end. We'll make this one a little bit softer, the transition, and then we can sort of rotate this around, move it down a little bit. And then, you know, maybe the other one, it's kind of sticking up a little bit more, so they're not exactly the same. It'll make it look a little bit better. Okay, and so you just want to do something similar on the other side, just something a little bit more natural. And then when you bump back up to your higher subdivision levels, you'll have all that detail still there. Okay, now you may need to come in once we've posed and do a little bit of sculpting on this to kind of tighten up the joints and things like that, and things have changed now. And so you can do that as well. So I'm going to go ahead and add a little bit of a pose to this piece here, and then continue on with this arm over here. And then in the next lesson, we'll come in and let's talk about adding and manipulating materials and also lights. And then we'll talk about UVs following that before we get into actually creating some texture. So let's go ahead and do that next.